Let me give you an example. Let's imagine a simple culture where a bunch of people live in a concentrated place, like a castle or a city building, a skyscraper, and every day they scatter out into the countryside and they grow some food. They gather it back in, they eat, they take care of themselves, they spend their extra time engaging in arts and culture and planning the food growing that they're going to do, all very explicitly and directly. This is simple because it's just food and survival, and it's talked about directly. This is imaginary, this does not exist. Contrast that with what we do have. We have an elaborated culture of accumulated intermediary steps between the way we produce sustenance and the way we distribute it. We have money. That's the most obvious example of a mediation between those two things. It's got the longest historical record of doing that. And attached to money, making it even more elaborated and complicated, are things like insurance, uh, government, what the money is backed on in terms of interest rates. Let's see. The stock market and the evaluation, reasonable or not, of companies that are making other intangible products like technology, like just computer code. Let's see, what was I gonna say? It is my thesis that we are facing as humanity a very important point in our evolution and development in our history that requires as much collective, intelligent attention as we could possibly apply. And if we are distracted from solving the climate crisis, I don't even necessarily think of it as a crisis, but I think of it as an existential threat to us as a species, not necessarily to nature as a whole, to our geopolitical quarrels, to our population and demographic issues, and just to generally finding a sustainable way to coexist into the future that is not haphazardly extractive, but circular and careful with the resources, the limited resources that we have here on Earth. So to take the contrasting types of cultures, the simple culture and the elaborated culture, my thesis is that we are in a hyper elaborated culture that's built on certain foundations, not in necessarily a causal or logical way, but property rights, capitalism, um, linear, mechanistic, algorithmic thinking, bureaucracy, and the specialization of skills, and the extraction of nature of food as efficiently as possible. That's also a very important part of that, because that's not the only way to get food or to grow food. There are ways of getting plenty of food less efficiently with more manual labor, like permaculture, syntropic agroforestry, or just regenerative agriculture, that they require more labor, but they can still feed you and they do not deplete the soil or pollute the soil, which is our lifeblood. I think actually Homo and Homo sapiens, I just heard this today, is etymologically rooted in soil or earth or something like that. I forget what the exact thing was, but the thing is, we are the wise creature that came from the earth. Anyways, it is my thesis that we need to focus on the issues directly. And currently we're ignoring them. We just hit 8 billion people, and no one said anything to me about it. I decided to Google the population counter, and I discovered that, in fact, we had hit this mark, which seems very significant to me, which is only 2 billion less than the hypothesized limit upon which our resources would be stretched, and hopefully everyone will be sufficiently modernized and infertile and glued to screens to have replacement or below replacement fertility rates, which would be about 2.1 successful births per woman or per family. But okay, that's better. So it is my life mission to stop using money and to destroy the bureaucracy. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to have a much more sophisticated game plan here. I'm going to try to demonstrate my competence in traditional means in my local community, lowering myself to the mundane and trivial anti-entropy upkeep of society. I'm a house cleaner and I want to grow food and literally get my hands dirty, despite the fact that my IQ is in the top 99.9 whatever percentile. And I am capable of doing very lucrative, abstract, comfortable, ass sore inducing white collar types of work. I find them intolerable. And I can only do honest work like building a house or something. So I'm planning to do that. I plan to have a content empire to awaken people to our higher calling as humanity, to the potential that is latent within us, to our connection with God, to a non-hedonistic, non-escapist fantasy way of living, to a faith in the human spirit, in consciousness itself, in contrast to its near antithesis, which I would say is technologically deterministic artificial intelligence, which scares me because I see that it is impressive. And this is something that I started to go to school for, and I wanted to build myself until I realized that certain things I wanted it to do were going to be theoretically impossible. That the idea that you could make a computer that actually understands language was philosophically malfounded. But despite this, kids today, adults today, but especially kids today, are so enamored and impressed with this stuff, and everything in our culture points towards the worshiping of this type of technology. We say, oh, you have 2 X chromosomes or 2 Y chromosomes, you should be a career scientist. This is like the most respectable thing a child could do. And it's a weird feature of our way of parenting and raising that we are satisfied and impressed with our child reaching these kinds of jobs that only a small proportion of the population could reasonably do if we were to have a sustain, a reasonably divided up like not everyone can be a scientist or engineer or piano prodigy. Like someone has to change the garbage and wash the toilet and stock the shelves and drive the trucks and all that. And so the fact that AI can make stuff that these kids are told they need the fact that AI can supposedly do anything, that's what we hypothesize it can do. No one in the public conversation talking about AI, whether it's Elon Musk or one of the crypto guys or especially any elected political official trying to talk about it or put it into law, like Andrew Yang trying to give us universal basic income for its supposed downstream effects of taking our jobs. They don't place any philosophical limit on what it could potentially do. But it is ultimately limited because it is not conscious and it is not human. So, despite all of our flaws, despite our meatness and our predilection to sin, we are a necessary component in the eternal mediation between order and entropy. There will always be dirt and dust to clean. There will always be food to grow, branches to prune, gears to tune up, walls to paint, whatever you name it. Mundane things, but in the vision that I want to bestow in this content empire, plant the seed for it at least, is that we're actually given as interdimensional embodied souls, like whatever our soul is not necessarily only here. It is also part of the divine that is everywhere and transcends time, evidenced by our continuous experience of it through consciousness. And through this embodiment, we are just given a great opportunity to experience. And life is actually quite long. I'm 24 now, and ever since I was like 14 or 16, I felt old. So how old I feel now is like incomprehensible. It feels like I've been on Earth forever. And it's sad that I'm going to die someday. It's sad that science isn't going to make us all immortal and we'll have like one final party and we'll just make some cool music beats and do drugs and take the immortality vaccine. It's sad that I'm going to die, but it's also necessary and right in a way. But despite that, we're given an opportunity to experience across a lifespan, which is actually very long. I want to make the content empire, that was number 2. I want to stop using money in my lifetime. That's number 3. I want to pay off my debts using the success from conventional economic positioning and honest work, and I only will do honest work. And once my debts are paid off, like my school debt or whatever, I want to live honestly. I want to live real and raw, and I want to know that my right to exist is not something I have to negotiate with a faceless, nameless, faraway entity that is the government or the legal system, and its feelings about whether or not I pay property taxes, which are basically just state rent, or whether I follow specific laws that it set that are outdated and amoral. I'm using amoral instead of immoral because it's just nothing. It's just not moral at all. Or whatever reason that these bureaucratic, unfeeling institutions might have to restrict my freedom or lock me up or even kill me. I want to live despite those. I want to know that if I'm going to be killed by my community, that that is a conscious and human act and not a mechanistic, rule following, dehumanizing murder. If I'm killed, I want to be killed by a human, and then that's fine. If I'm gonna live and be protected, I want that to be through humans, not the law or the tax system or whatever. I want to know that if my food's gonna show up on the table, that that was my responsibility and my neighbor's responsibility, and I played a role in that, and I can see whether or not, the next few years are gonna look all right. Um, Recognizing the exception of a terrible storm coming from Mother Nature, she can always do whatever she wants, but I don't want it to be based on the value of the dollar, or based on the pandemic, or based on the stock market, or based on trading, or based on China. If I'm gonna, I just want to live real and raw. I want to live honestly. I want to live connected, and it's more vulnerable that way, that I don't have institutions protecting me, making me safe, and making me at the same time subject to its order. However inflexible that may be. But that's the way I want to live. And I know that other people crave that. It's fascinating to me that all around the world, independently, people seem to have this idea of a commune, and it would go by many different names, but people want to gather and form an intentional community and revamp society kind of just from the ground up. The homogenization of our culture and the globalization of it and the scale of it, just generally the scale of it, especially, which has been especially accelerated through the internet, is inherently dehumanizing, because to be understood is to be understood in your specificity. And so the more pseudo human care we receive and pseudo entertainment we receive through digital means, the less actual specific attention is paid to me and the less specific attention I pay to others. And this is actually a very scary and very troubling thing, I find, in the same vein that I find that we can sit around and have a conversation about how to best hack the tax code to claim the most deductibles and retire at an early age, collecting a pension and a 401k and getting a certain insurance thing, but making sure not to work a certain number of hours per week, because then that would affect your tax incentives and all this bullshit, when the whole conversation was just about like, hey, I'm gonna get old and tired and I hope my community will care for me. I have a cat, And the cat goes in and out through the window in my room, which leads to a roof, which leads to a staggered ladder that I built for him. And I found this cat under a car, in a car actually. So he's kind of badass. He's an indoor-outdoor cat for sure. He kills mice for sure. He's a terror to the local fauna for sure. But the fauna could terrorize him as well. There are coyotes and hawks. Yet I still let him outside. I'm a fatalist in this way. I understand that he can be killed, and I will cry if he is. But I would not have a cat if it was kept inside. This would be against the nature of the cat. It would be against what I feel is right. I could only have this kind of indoor-outdoor cat relationship because that's what I think is the right way for a cat to live. Now, a human being is not quite the same thing. We're like self-domesticated in a way. Cats, not so much. Cats kind of like walked into humans' lives, whereas dogs, on the other hand, are actually really domesticated and like retarded, so they couldn't survive on their own in the wild. They're not built for it. Whereas a cat still is pretty much a wild animal, just kind of like can tolerate an ape booping its head. But the same way that I'm fatalistic about cats, I think I'm fatalistic about human beings in my own life. I think there exists a very efficient and very productive system which I would not destroy or deconstruct haphazardly, which I still think we should use for the time being. I think we should farm conventionally with Haber process produced synthetic nitrogen, which destroys the soil if overused, which it always is, until we can grow sustainably, grow regenerative food, grow with regenerative agriculture. But if that change is never made, if that transition is never had, if we are never rewilded and return to a local, comprehensible, humane, specific, loving society, and that can be globally distributed, then the machine will produce bare survival, and it will merely tolerate subjective experience. And so this is what I think is the Antichrist, in a way. It's not exactly a human, although humans can defend and like represent it, because it is purely logical and rational, which the devil was, and the devil was very intelligent. So says the Bible, whatever. I don't believe this literally, but I believe people back then understood the interaction between these types of abstractions, especially as they compete within the human mind, and they could see how the rational mind, for all of its power, was fundamentally flawed in a certain way, that it should have been subjectivated or submitted to the power of God, which is, harder to label and describe, or impossible to, but that unimpeded, the rational drive could and will into the future come to dominate the entire face of the earth. And I think that's what it's doing and what it will do unless conscious action is taken. And I'm using this word intentionally here. I'm not just a hippie who likes the word consciousness. I think I actually understand what it is. And it's very simple. It is my experience. And my experience for existing is the basis, we're speaking philosophically here in terms of value, it is the basis for anything having value at all. If this were a dark universe and nothing were conscious, there would be no suffering, there would be no joy, there would be no love, there would be no qualitative experience to be had. I really don't think anything would matter. It's also a hypothetical that is impossible to actually entertain, as most real philosophical hypotheticals about these types of abstractions are. But nevertheless, the positive side of that is still true. My consciousness and your consciousness and all of the consciousness out there, in the cats and the cows and the rocks and the grass and in the ocean and probably the sun too, is the basis for value and meaning. And the rational, logical, algorithmic, bureaucratic, globalized machine will keep you alive, and it will tolerate the fact that you have subjective experience because you will totally internalize it and squash it down into a fantasy, as most of us do. And you will do this even more, and your children will do this even more when they have the goggles glued to their fucking face all day. I'm talking about VR. But the machine will not allow consciousness to reign in charge. Let's do a little sidebar and I'll tie it back in about the specialization of labor. This was one of humanity's most important developments in our history, in our creation of cities. Once we had agriculture and calorie surpluses, we weren't all laboring after food or simple survival things. We could start working with metal and wood more skillfully and do a lot of cool stuff with that. And it took entire generations, compounded on generations, of passing down knowledge to develop metallurgy. So it was necessary to specialize in humanity's grand development. But that can't go on forever. We can't specialize to the point of atomic hyper specialization, where every bureaucratic function in the maintenance of society is only responsible for that one part of it and can only see what that role is supposed to see. Because that doesn't understand systems as a whole, because systems as a whole are interacting and are not logical and linear. And that system will create rules with lots of, exceptions and precedents and interpretive dialectics that inherently do not respect the subjective experience. And this was, at the same time, just with capitalism, just with agriculture, conventional agriculture, as with bureaucracy, as with many of our systems that are falling into, how man developed, they're so good, so productive, and they have so many admirable and honorable qualities, but they just cannot be, at the end of the day, in my vision, in charge. Man has to be in charge. Consciousness has to be in charge. And our story as man, I think going back to way before recorded history, is an internal fight within ourselves about responsibility. And so if you look at the Bible, for example, it starts off with God being all-powerful, pretty mysterious, pretty patriarchically stern and punishing. And gradually, God becomes more forgiving, but more importantly, humanity takes on more responsibility. The Jews start organizing their society. They think they understand God. It becomes a dogma. Chaos ensues. It falls apart. They have to restart. The Jews struggle with God in this way, and this is a profound wisdom that they have encoded into their culture, which is partly why they are so successful. But even just looking at the mythology beyond that, Adam and Eve, just like from the very beginning, are banished from the Garden of Eden, where everything is taken care of for them, to now where they must toil in the soil and take care of themselves. Later on, Noah builds an ark. He has to save the fucking world. And the New Testament, although it's separate from, that original document, is kind of the culmination of that, yet to be fully realized, where God is manifested in a man such that man takes the responsibility of God. Ultimately, what I think this means is that we have to recognize that life and death is in our hands. To me, this is a matter of retrospective recognition. First off, we're currently, and we have been, killing each other in our own societies through the law. The outsourcing of this responsibility to the monopoly of violence that is the legal system and police enforcement is just a way of saying that's not my individual responsibility, but it is still our collective responsibility. And bullying is eugenic, and murder is eugenic. Going back to the savannah, the ways that we socially push upon each other and assert dominance and fight for social status and resources, like you using a certain vocabulary in your PowerPoint presentation and refusing to give your one colleague a certain kind of emotional attention because you're competing with him for a promotion. You're fighting for life. Like, it's all very detached, but if you get more resources and you and your wife say, okay, we're going to have a baby now because we can afford it, he doesn't, blah, blah, blah. These are very subtle inching differences, but every way that we push and take from each other, we are taking life. And putting aside the physical resource aspect of that, which is nonetheless true, there's a psychological aspect of that. If you're not giving attention to someone, you are taking psychological and spiritual life from them. The kind of love that you give to people is giving them life. It is necessary for humans to survive. We're not totally autonomous, independent creatures. That's kind of bullshit. I mean, there's a grain of truth in there, as with all things, but we are limbically, emotionally, in our brains, dependent on each other, especially as babies, but continuing into adulthood to regulate our own emotions and our own physiology. And isolation is the most inhumane punishment for a reason. You can't even sleep. You can't even beat your own fucking heart correctly if you're not surrounded by other people just to fucking look into the eyes of. So the VR headset is not going to work. Zuck. And going to Mars is probably just a little far-fetched. And we need to prioritize the one planet that can keep us alive. And we need to kill the bad guys. And we need to kill the bad parts of ourselves. And we need to have faith in ourselves that we can be redeemed. Local success, media empire, stop using money. King of the world? I would be king of the world. Fight the devil? Um,
I've always wanted to start a little bakery where I make cute little cupcakes that say like,
I don't know. I couldn't complete that bit. Yeah, and then I want to make memories and give myself to the world through people, through artistic and other creative expressions in a way that will die when I die, when my brain rots, but will, in a way that is totally imperceptible and untraceable, leave a mark on the world in a way that I have faith will be a positive contribution regardless. Maybe run a marathon too. Um, what else? This year, my New Year's resolution is to read a book a week. I'm on week 4. This is book number 4. It's okay. The other ones were good. What else? Yeah, if I ever see a humanoid robot in public, like trying to do a job of humans, I'm going to destroy it. I'm going to take out my rage on it. I'm uncomfortable saying this, but I actually know that I would unleash myself on that fucking thing like it were the devil. And if you tell Alexa to tell your kid a bedtime story instead of you doing that, you better have a really good fucking excuse. Because that's not all right. Because children need love and they need human beings, not robo-moms. Okay, that's it.